Previously on Loads of Resurrection Evidence.
If the only thing you had was the non-Christian sources, you wouldn't have enough evidence to say that the resurrection happened.
We agree.
But I think you don't need a whole load of extra detail from the Christian sources to make it quite plausible.
Plausible? Well, there's a ringing endorsement. Welcome to Apologia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. If you're new to the channel, please take a second to tap on the subscribe button so that you'll be notified when new science, theology, or news videos come out. This is part 2 of our gradual walkthrough of the epic-length 3.5-hour podcast on loads of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus with two scholars, though very much not historians, Callum Miller and Max Baker-Heitch. If you missed part 1, you'll be fine, but a link to the full Loads of Evidence playlist is above my head now for you to tap if you'd like to start at the beginning. After the discussion of non-biblical tidbits purported to endorse the direction that we covered in part 1, the duo spent the next 12 minutes talking about the varying beliefs found among first-century Jews about the Messiah and resurrection, claiming only a true resurrection event could have convinced people.
They rejected the idea of a resurrection. They rejected the idea that it would happen in the middle of history to one person. They rejected the idea that the Messiah would die.
That the first century Jewish religious leaders would have found the Jesus story uncompelling is not remarkable to me, as it remains uncompelling to 21st century Jewish religious leaders. It's not like the stories of the early Christians were of the religious elite becoming converts. No, it was the common people, the unschooled people, and it had far better success among the non-Jewish Gentiles. This line of argumentation is like claiming an anti-vaccination movement couldn't gain traction today, because most modern doctors agree that vaccinations are safe and good. And yet, here we are. But Godless Engineer recently went through this part of the podcast in greater detail if you want to hear more.
And where most biblical scholars do begin when talking about the New Testament sources is, so Paul's first letter to the Corinthians.
Yes, predictably these apologists will start with 1 Corinthians 15. We can skip the start of their defense of it, as I would stipulate that the letter was written by the Apostle Paul around 55 AD. This is a good 20 years after Jesus' death, but it is at least 15 years sooner than the writing of the first gospel account. Here's a refresher on the passage in question.
That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12.
Yeah, so when Paul writes this in 1 Corinthians 15, he's passing on what scholars generally agree is a creed.
This is creed, and he is in charge of something,
That
right?
is correct.
So that it's generally well preserved and in line with what actually happened.
What exactly about being a creed should instill us with confidence that it reflects what actually happened? Other religions have creeds that Callum and Max wouldn't accept as accurate. Creeds are a reflection of shared beliefs. Nothing more.
Paul clearly received it from others, and there's every indication that those others he received it from were the individuals who are named in that summary.
No. There's no indication at all in this passage that he received it from the individuals named. That's the popular apologist's speculation, but why would the eyewitnesses of the events tell Paul about the events in the form of an often recited creed rather than in colorful personal detail? If the famous egg himself is personally relaying to me the tale of his fall from the Great Wall, he's unlikely to merely recite the exact third-person creed phrase, "All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again." No. The every indication is that Paul heard this creed from unremarkable people who merely learned to recite the creed from other unremarkable people.
So we're getting within like a very few years of the events. I think James Dunn even says, a few months probably.
James Dunn may be willing to claim a few months during casual talks, but in his scholarly book on 1 Corinthians, he moderates this dating estimate to within 2 or 3 years of Christianity's beginnings. Anything earlier than that would call for pure speculation that is beyond defensible research and might damage his academic reputation.
If we go through it kind of one by one, so he starts with Christ being crucified or killed according to the scriptures. And this is something that there's not a historian in the world who would doubt for a second.
I don't know about that. But if Jesus was a historical figure, then the least remarkable thing anyone could say about him is that he died. So I'm going to grant that Jesus died for the sake of argument and skip ahead to the next claim.
There's a very strong kind of commonality between not only 1 Corinthians 15, but also all of the gospel sources.
Well, sure. If you're right, and this creed had been recited over and over again throughout the 30 years between when the crucifixion happened and when the Gospels were finally put to paper, of course the Gospel writer would have to stick to the popular established outline in order to match audience expectation. You don't write a movie about Robin Hood and not include stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. It's what he's known for.
Yeah, so verse 4, it says that he was buried.
That he was buried, not where he was buried or how he was buried. Our earliest mention of burial of Jesus has no reference to a tomb.
A lot of the evidence for is by looking at the context and looking at the Jewish background. So in that case, you might think, well, maybe they didn't care about burying Jesus properly because he was a criminal. Whether he was a criminal or not, Jesus would have needed to have been given a burial simply for the sake of the land, to keep the land holy in accordance with Jewish law.
The intentions of the Israelites may have been thus, but this was a land under control of the Romans, and all historical evidence about the practice of crucifixion was that it was intended to be a painful and publicly humiliating deterrent. Every historical reference to Roman crucifixion validates this. A Korea tombstone inscription, a letter from Roman author Horace, Roman satirist Juvenal, dream interpreter Artemidorus, and Satyricon of Petronius. All gruesome pictures of bodies left for long periods of time for scavengers. Disrespect of the crucified bodies was the normal, usual case. This is not in dispute. Outside of the Bible, history provides only one brief mention of any allowance of deviation from this humiliating fate in this quotation from Philo, a Jewish philosopher living in Alexandria. On the emperor's birthday, a Roman holiday, not a Jewish holiday, Philo has heard of cases where crucifixion victim had been given to their family. This is the kind of exception that proves the rule. On a very special day, it has been known to happen. This is a far, far cry from it being any kind of normal circumstance. What normally happened was that the body was left and discarded in a ditch.
And this is something that you see in archaeology as well. So we see, we have the remains of many buried people in first century Israel. We see how dutifully and assiduously it was done.
How Jews buried their honored citizens isn't particularly relevant to how Rome dealt with criminals.
Just a few decades ago, we found the remains of a Jewish person called Yehohanan. He was a first century Jew found around Jerusalem. And so we found his ankle bone with a nail driven through it, showing that he was a victim of crucifixion. We have his remains, which show that a crucifixion victim was buried properly in the same way.
While there is some dispute over whether this was necessarily a crucifixion victim, I can grant it. We know that Rome was crucifying hundreds of people in a week, sometimes in a day. And in all the discovered ossuaries, we have only one potential crucifixion victim. Again, the pattern is starkly clear. Mass burial is what usually happened to someone crucified. Normal Jewish burial of such a person is a rare exception, and so noted as an exception to what usually happened.
And the main kind of opposition to this that comes from scholars is a few scholars who say, well, in the first century, we have lots of Jews who weren't buried properly.
Exactly. Lots of Jews who weren't buried properly.
And this is a suggestion that actually, if Jesus was an enemy of the state or whatever, if he was executed as a criminal, he would have just been thrown in a ditch or buried in a ditch rather than buried in a tomb.
Exactly. The normal thing that happened seems like it would be the normal thing to happen.
But actually, if you look at that evidence for Jews who weren't buried, it was pretty much always in the Jewish-Roman War at the end of the 60s. AD.
Before we get to this pre-war, post-war question, I'm going to jump backward to an earlier point in the interview where Callum and Max are asked what scholarship they would recommend for people to read on this topic.
The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Michael Licona and Gary Habermas.
Mike Licona and Gary Habermas are the first experts Callum and Max recommend. Indeed, most Christians defer to Mike and Gary on resurrection scholarship. So I'm going to let Gary Habermas himself take this question.
What is the earliest historical evidence we have of Jews criminals being thrown into a mass grave? Does it come at the time of Nero, around 70 AD, or does it come before then?
Okay, first of all, you're going to be hard put to nail exact historical references when it was done.
We'll hear the rest of Gary's answer in just a minute, but for now, the relevant piece is that according to the world's foremost Christian resurrection expert, we have no historical references that make the kind of time distinction Callum is trying to make. It's a hypothetical without evidential support.
There was no reason why they couldn't bury their dead in Jerusalem in the 30s AD.
As I believe I've shown, all our historical sources tell us that Romans left bodies on the crosses and then threw them in mass graves as the normal course of action. The only historical note of exception is notable because it was clearly an exception by the Jewish author's own words. The entire premise of the 3.5-hour podcast we're walking through is an attempt to show that the resurrection is statistically more probable than not. And yet, we're being asked to ignore the overwhelming statistical near certainty that a crucified Jesus would not have been buried in a tomb. To drive this home, let's let Christian resurrection scholar of scholars, Gary Habermas, finish his answer to Cameron's question about whether burial in a mass grave was the most likely outcome.
But I would concede, and many would, that that's what happened to most people.
And just in case that isn't clear enough, let's also hear it from Mike Licona, the other scholar that Max and Callum deferred to.
Most likely he would have just been, tossed into a shallow grave or something like this, or mass grave, and eaten by dogs, maybe.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
Well, it is true that was typically the typical practice of the Romans to do that.
Once again, for people in the back, a mass grave is what happened to most crucifixion victims. It was the most likely fate of Jesus. The leading Christian experts agree. This isn't a fringe theory. It's what most likely happened. Could there have been a rare exception for Jesus? It's possible, but to pretend it's likely is to fail to be intellectually honest.
1 Corinthians 15 verse 4 says that he was buried. And, I think it's important to say actually that even if we didn't have the gospel sources that we're about to talk about in a minute, we would still have very good reason for thinking that Jesus was given a proper burial, that he was not just thrown in a ditch. The Greek verb is thapto, and it definitely is not the kind of word that one would associate with a disgraceful sort of burial, just being chucked in a ditch in the ground.
Now, there aren't any descriptions of disgraceful ditch burials in the New Testament, so we can't really use that to do much of a comparison of the nuances of the Greek verb thapto. Though in Matthew 8 and Luke 9, when Jesus gets frustrated about excuses to not follow him, he bites back. Let the dead bury their own dead. And it's that same verb, thapto. Doesn't sound particularly respectful. Fortunately, I came across this 2019 paper on the archaeology of Jewish burials in early Roman Palestine. It contains an extensive appendix detailing the ancient Greek language records of Jewish burials of various kinds, from rock-cut tombs of elites, to field graves of farmers, to trench graves of non-elites. In near every instance, and across the board of burial type, the verb used is thapto, including those referencing disgraced graves. Max claimed that the verb alone rules out a ditch grave, yet here are 10 instances where thapto specifically referred to ditch graves. Sorry, Max, but no.
And so, Joseph of Arimathea is recorded in all 4 Gospels as...
Cool. It's been a while since I've had a chance to use this. The character whom we are told collected the body of Jesus is mentioned nowhere outside the Bible. Unless you count movies about the Holy Grail.
and was entrusted to Joseph of Arimathea. The Arthur legend.
Of course, Joseph of Arimathea. Of course.
And, even if Luke and Matthew only had Mark as their source,
He's referring to the fact that Luke and Matthew copied large portions of Mark word for word.
but even if that's true, most probably John is a separate source from Mark. And so Joseph of Arimathea is multiply attested.
He says probably a separate source rather than is a separate source, because some scholars do find evidence that John utilized Mark as an outline or more. And John was written a few decades after Mark, so the Joseph of Arimathea character was already part of the legend by that time, perhaps even from the pre-Mark oral tradition that started it all. Either way, it's for the Bible tells me so.
So just taking the name Joseph of Arimathea itself. So
something interesting on that point, Eckhard Schnabel has actually said that Joseph was the second most common male name among Palestinian Jews.
Yes, well, and the fact exactly.
Wait,
and
what? You're telling me that because Joseph was an incredibly common name, that should increase my confidence that someone named Joseph would have to be historical? Like if I was to tell you about my friend John Smith, you should immediately be certain he's a real person because that's a common name? Not at all. When you hear John Smith, you immediately suspect that the person is made up.
Joseph was a very common name, so you had to have a way to distinguish him from other Josephs.
You know my friend Bill from Seattle, the one who owns a dragon? He's totally real because Bill is a very common name, and Seattle is a real town. Oh wait, speaking of real towns.
Attaching his hometown, Arimathea, would be exactly the kind of way, as we know from archaeology, that people with a common name would have been distinguished.
It's funny that you should mention archaeology, because to date, there's no archaeological evidence at all for a town named Arimathea. Apparently, the author of the Gospel of Luke would know that his audience hadn't heard of it, so he added a note that it was a Jewish town to reassure those scratching their heads. Fast forward to the 4th century, and historian Eusebius of Caesarea recognized the oversight and tried to identify Arimathea with Ramathaim Zophim, a town in Ephraim. However, no reasons to support this alternate name are given, and no historical or archaeological evidence has ever been found to back this claim. In his book The Empty Tomb, Robert Price observes that a reasonable translation of the word Arimathea is Best Disciple Town. Best Disciple Town. Yeah, that definitely doesn't sound made up.
We can also add something known as the criterion of embarrassment.
If you're a regular viewer of my channel, you've heard me speak at length about the criterion of embarrassment before. Most notably, that this is not a historical criteria that is used outside of New Testament studies, only within the New Testament for some reason. I'm still waiting for an example of its use by a professional historian in any other context.
So the fact that the one who buries Jesus honorably is Joseph of Arimathea, this member of the council that condemned Jesus to death, is some reason to think that this story is not made up. Because, it would be much less awkward for the gospel writers to have some of Jesus' male disciples carry the burial out, such as Peter or John.
Except that according to the decades of oral tradition, the disciples had all fled the scene. They can't be in hiding and still take down the body. Now, I wonder if there's any historical reason that if you had to invent a character to take the body, that you might make him a member of the Sanhedrin.
It was one of the duties of the Sanhedrin to provide places for criminals to be buried if no one else did.
Interesting. So it seems to me that if you needed to invent a character to take the body, it would be most believable to make him someone who was responsible for taking bodies as part of his job. Like, if you needed a character in your story to fix someone's car, you might make that character a mechanic.
We have really quite compelling evidence that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, where Christians commemorate the crucifixion and burial of Jesus, is in fact where Jesus was buried. But in 2017, we actually found pretty good evidence, pretty compelling evidence, in fact, that it was the exact place that's been commemorated since at least the early 4th century. And the evidence for this was when they looked in the tomb itself and they looked in the shrine, they found that the Roman kind of remains commemorating Jesus' death dated to the mid-4th century.
Just so everyone's keeping these dates straight in their head, because a modern team dated some concrete to the 4th century, we can therefore be confident that it's in Jesus' tomb from the 1st century. Does that follow in any way? By the way, if you still have Disney Plus and are waiting around for Mandalorian Season 2, they're streaming a National Geographic documentary on this excavation and renovation called The Secrets of Christ's Tomb.
And this itself is quite astonishing, because the mid-4th century is when Constantine lived and when his mother found the tomb and began to kind of commemorate it officially.
So what happened was, Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, and he was so excited about it that he sent his mother to Jerusalem to find holy sites. So, imagine you're a Christian in Jerusalem in the 4th century, suddenly free of persecution because of the emperor's mother, and she comes to town asking about where Jesus was buried. Is it really astonishing that people would be tripping over themselves to show her literally any plausible location in order to continue this new favored status?
Often when you go to Israel, you look at these kind of traditional sites for events in Jesus' life, and they're often just made up. And that's completely understandable. We know in most kind of religions and pilgrimage sites, there's lots of scope for making things up. And sometimes doing it centuries and centuries after the events actually occurred.
This is my point.
So the question is, did the same site survive from Jesus' time to Constantine's time?
Exactly. Here's Professor Joan Taylor, Professor of Christian Origins at King's College London, from the aforementioned National Geographic documentary, to lay out the compelling evidential case for thinking that Constantine's mom got it right.
I used to be very skeptical. I just thought it was so very convenient for Constantine to create a new edifice just where the Temple of Venus was.
It could be that Constantine simply picked the temple site without really knowing if it was connected to Jesus.
But the interesting thing is, as I've grown older, I'm more accepting of tradition being passed on by older people and memory continuing on.
Taylor thinks that Christian parents would have told their children and their children's children, ensuring that the whereabouts of Jesus' burial place would have cascaded down through the generations.
Okay, so the entire case is, I'm pretty sure people would have told their kids. Nothing to bolster the idea that the tradition was based on an actual fact. The professor just has a good feeling about it.
So even if you go now to Jerusalem and you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, literally just about, I remember it being about 20 meters away from the site of Jesus' tomb, we have what archaeologists have shown to be 1st century tombs. And so we know this is a 1st century Jewish cemetery.
How astonishing that those who wanted to establish a pilgrimage site for an empty tomb would pick a spot that had tombs.
And then the only other thing to say, which is really striking given how pilgrimage sites normally work and given what the land of Israel is normally like, is that there is not a single competing burial site in the tradition.
Except for this one.
Here we are at the entrance to the Garden Tomb, which is the main alternative location offered for the site of the tomb of Jesus.
All right, so I've given you the basic reasons why some people are convinced that this is the tomb of Jesus and why the site of the crucifixion is nearby.
In the tradition of Christian pilgrimage, there's never been a single other site that has been suggested as where Jesus was crucified and buried.
Except also this one.
In the spring of 1980, in Tel Piot, South Jerusalem, construction blasting exposed the entrance to a burial tomb. It was 2,000 years old.
I have no real doubt that this is to be read Yeshua, and then Yeshua bar Yehoseph, that is Jesus, son of Joseph.
And they knew that they couldn't just make somewhere up. They had to go with what the tradition said.
With all due respect to my Catholic friends, if the reason you accept that a proposition is true is purely on tradition, then you don't have sufficient reason to accept it. If you have other reasons to accept it, then you're not accepting it because of tradition. Let's wrap up what we've learned here today. Most crucifixion victims were buried in unmarked graves, if at all. Sometimes a crucifixion victim would be buried properly, but this was not usual. The evidence that Joseph of Arimathea was given Jesus' body is poor. The evidence that we know where Jesus' tomb was is poor. Since a tomb burial is the least likely occurrence, probable priors and all that, it would require the most evidence to be considered most probable. And we didn't see that today. Maybe next time? If part 3 has arrived by the time you're watching this, you'll see an image to click to continue to that now. If not, you'll see part 1, so you can refresh where we began. Until next time, later.